So I'd like to invite you to walk with me along the path of a peculiar journey, the outcome of which has been a new kind of dialogue. The stories along this way describe the quiet emergence of a profoundly different way of talking, thinking, working, and living together. I want to reflect further on the significant changes in me and changes in the lives of many that perhaps may lead to change in you, the listener, as we travel together.
Hello, and welcome to A New Kind of Dialogue, the podcast. I'm Jane Ball, co-founder of Dialogue Associates, along with Peter Garrett. To talk to people, it's best to use monologue. Dialogue is different. It's about talking and thinking with people. Through dialogue, we discover how interconnected we are and how we all contribute to the situation we're experiencing, whether we like it or not. Through what we call professional dialogue, we work with all sorts of organisations to enhance their health, effectiveness and prosperity. In this podcast, we aim to bring the concept of dialogue into your life and the way you work. Throughout this series, we'll be hearing some of the experiences and unpacking some of the learning from Peter's book, A New Kind of Dialogue. The book, as I mentioned in the foreword, is not a how-to-do dialogue book, and neither is this podcast. Instead, we invite you to think, feel and reflect on your own life as we explore some of Peter's lifetime of research and first-hand learning. Through that, you can discover a much deeper understanding of dialogue and its benefits to your own life and work. Over the course of 10 episodes, we'll be exploring parts of the book's 26 chapters. Towards the end of this episode, we'll be hearing from Bernhard Holtrop, a Swedish consultant who takes his clients into the wild to have a more profound experience of connection with each other and the world as they converse around the campfire. Chapters 1, 2 and 3 are on the agenda for today, spanning Peter's origins in Africa, leaving Africa and eventually leaving society. So, Peter, we are co-founders of Dialogue Associates, which happened in 2003, as I've said, but we actually met in 1999. I accepted the invitation to join you on the journey that you've described, and we've worked together continuously over that time. I've learned and experienced some amazing things, and I think we've done some really important work in the world that you tell through this book and that we want to describe in this podcast. So we'll pick up on more of my part in some of that work later on. I think I join you in chapter 10, but really I want to hear from you why you finally wrote a book and what you're hoping people will take from your experiences and learning.
Well, one thing to say is I wouldn't have written the book without your help. You know a little bit about that. I have been involved in dialogue work for nearly 40 years, and I didn't write at all, or hardly wrote, and eventually it made the space for me to do that. So I didn't write because I didn't want to prescribe how people do things. And it was a little battle for me to work it out that I could talk about my experience, what I learned from it, and not have people remember that and do that, but have people concentrate on their own learning. Once I got that clear, then I felt I could write the book, describe how I've learned from my life as an incentive for other people to learn from their lives and move forward. That's why you rightly say it's not a how-to-do-it book. Remember these 7 points and you'll get there. It's more, where are you and what are you doing and how are you doing it? And I tell that through story. I try and keep a bit of pace to the story so that it's interesting to read the next chapter and move on.
Do you think that it's an easy thing for people to do, to turn their experiences into knowledge and learning?
Well, it does take reflection, doesn't it? It does take self-reflection. It's very helpful if you have other people to reflect with. So in some ways, dialogue is almost like a group of people talking together, reflecting on their experiences and hearing responses to that and shaping their story. But an essential is reflection. And self-reflection is the hardest bit. You have to be more honest with yourself than you can be socially with other people. The recognition of your own intentions and misdemeanors.
So let's head into your first chapter, an early chapter of your life. The title was Origins in Africa, about your childhood. Could you just give us a bit of an overview of that phase of your life? Maybe sketch a picture of your childhood in Africa.
Well, my two children are Africans. They were born in Africa. I was born in the UK. I left when I was 3. Africa is, for anyone who's spent any time there, is very different from any other part of the world. See, it feels like the oldest part of the world, civilization-wise. So being in Africa had a profound impact on me. I was also lucky because when I was there, it was not a heavily civilized country. Not many people have a chance to get out of civilization, but where I lived as a child, when you drove down the road, come out of the town, there were no fences, there were no gates. You could drive across the land, a lot of wild animals, a lot of wild birds, and you could feel how the ecology worked. You could be part of it. And it's beautiful, but also quite dangerous. So you have to be attentive to what's happening in the wild. But that's the big thing for me, was the roots of the wild and the roots of civilization, really, I suppose.
You also describe, and I think it's relevant, you also describe your family home, though, which seemed less wild.
Well, my family, I was very comfortable as a child. I liked my parents, I loved them, they loved me. There was a safety there for me. I also had an older sister and a younger brother. I was kind of in the middle there and did very well with it. And our home was very warm and welcoming. But also, being in Africa at that time, we had employees who were African who lived nearby in another dwelling on the same property. And we were in a country that it didn't have apartheid, but it definitely had big racial distinctions between wealthier white people and poorer black people. So as a child, I walked to school. So this is very early primary school. I'd walk on my own to school a mile. People walking past didn't have shoes. Most people were barefooted. The big thing was to have a bicycle, and a bicycle with a flag on it or something. But very safe, although there were such huge differences. So I grew up with a lot of difference, radical differences between race and wealth and so on.
What impact do you think that had? You've got a very comfortable and very safe, very caring family. You have the racial differences. You also have the wilderness. Just wonder, balancing those things. I would have been balancing very different things in my life. What impact do you think that had on you growing up?
Well, if we took the racial one, I had a white mother. I had a number of black nannies. I call them nannies. I think that is okay. I don't want to offend anybody in terms of language or whatever, but the black nannies, to me, were very warm and close and physical, and I got a lot from my relationship with them. My mother was colder. She was more intellectual and less physical, but between the two, I had a wealth. And it wasn't like, oh, I like my nanny, I don't like my mother, or vice versa. It was actually enriching to have both. Now, the same thing, I lived as youngest in Bulawayo, which is a developed city, but went right out into the wilds. There was what was called a Rhodesian Schools Exploration Society. We drove into an area that had never been mapped. It's amazing. Went several days, lorry, then Land Rovers, make roads, and then with a larger group actually map the area, look at what animals are there, what insects, what birds, and so on. So that was right in the wild. I kind of had both.
Yeah.
And it wasn't either or, it was both. It was remarkable. I feel blessed.
And being enriched by these extremes.
Yes.
Not torn apart by them, enriched by them.
Yeah, I mean, archaeology was my thing. I was too young to go, but my father was the radio, the wireless connection with, in case it was needed. But I went on the archaeology group. That was the big thing for me. I knew what I was doing in the bush. I was comfortable moving around because we spent a lot of time in the bush. But it's different from the way many people do. A lot of people go into the bush with a gun. They're going hunting. That's a different experience from what I'm talking about, being in the bush and being comfortable being there. And my experience was that I had, for example, gone on a friend's farm with my parents and found a Bushman painting, outcrop of rock. I thought, how amazing. I could find a Bushman painting. Now, Bushman, it was painted a long time ago. And in the archaeology group, what we had the chance was to start to find the waste of early people. We have a debris of plastic through all the oceans. They had stone implements, and we found them. In fact, we made them first to know how to find them, but we found them. So that had a big impact on me, realizing what early people were like.
Yeah.
Those people were not that different from you and me as I experienced it. The world doesn't look like it did then, but I don't think they were that different from you and me in how they thought and how they felt. But they had access to a whole integrated, interconnected world that they belonged to and belonged in. Now we own bits of the world and fight about the bits we own and have a very different experience of life.
Well, there are two things. I'll name them both and see where you might pick up on. One is this question of people taking guns and you didn't take guns. Do people take guns because of fear? I'm wondering if many people in those circumstances might have experienced fear, but I hear no fear in you. So I was wondering if you think other people would have been afraid in those circumstances, but you weren't, and what difference that lack of fear and that comfort in the environment has made, how that was carried, how you took that with you in what happened next. But the other question was this, that you're raising about Stone Age people. You say you experience them as being the same as us. However, there's also a difference. In the book, you talk about there's a difference as well.
I mean, the aim of the book is to understand the origins of the dialogue work. And I can't speak for why people carry guns. Some go hunting and what they see in the wild are animals to shoot, and that's fine. Some carry guns for defense. I know as a child my parents had a gun in the drawer between their bed. A couple of times without them knowing, I picked it up. And it seemed, they never used it, but they obviously had a bit of fear. I didn't have fear in the bush, but it is dangerous there. You might think something like a baboon is not, like a monkey. You corner a baboon, it's very vicious and very powerful. Where in the bush I was in, there are snakes. And I nearly stood on a gaboon viper. And do you know what a gaboon viper is? It's short and thick and coloured with diamonds on the back. But snake's not going to bite you. You're not natural prey. But if you're not aware and attentive, you can suffer badly. Step on a snake, scorpions around, the very insects and so on. Came across one spider's web, went from one tree to another that were about 15 yards apart. One spider's web, large spider in it. Yeah, now, you're going to be attentive, not walk into that and not know what you're doing. So the key learning for me from that was if you're aware and attentive and you read the signals that are around, which are all around all the time, it's not dangerous at all. In fact, you're part of it, and you have a part to play in it.
What I was thinking with the Stone Age people is you talk about discovering that they're not that different from us.
Mm.
But also there are ways in which they would be very different from us because of their relationship with their environment. So I wanted to invite you to explore or say something about the differences as well as the similarities.
how I encountered Stone Age people, you might say, how did I meet them if they're not there? Well, the archaeologist, Cran Cook, and 6 schoolboys in a Land Rover would drive around, find rock, and then he'd stop and say, okay, we're now going to learn how to make Stone Age implements. Now, what did Stone Age people do? They made Stone Age implements. That's their waste, unlike ours, which is enormous. Theirs is long-lasting and very sophisticated and very useful. Where would they make them? I thought, where would I? Well, it takes a while to do. Where would I choose to be? Well, you have a large outcome. I'd choose to sit up there, I think. You're not quite in the wind. You've got the sun. That's a really nice place to sit and do it. So I was quite good at it. I'd say, why don't we have a look up there? And there you'd find a whole lot of Stone Age implements. We found boxes of them. It's incredible, really, when you think about it. Area had never been mapped, and they were finding boxes with Stone Age implements. So I'm thinking, well, if I would sit up there, and they would, well, maybe they'd be over there. And sure enough, and these people had the same sensibility I had, right? The difference between then and now, what did they have? They had the stars at night, sunshine in the day. They spent very little time looking for food. They didn't work 14-hour days. To hunter-gatherer finding food is quite short hours. They had a lot of time to sit and appreciate what's around them. To a very holistic, belonging, interconnected thing in which you have to be quite attentive and aware, which I believe they were. Now we have a situation where we can't feel how everything's integrated and joined together. We've got roofs over our heads. We don't see the stars. So we'll go outside, but there's too much outside light. If you're lucky and you travel right away out of the city, you start to see the sky. Why they put the telescopes right out. Right? So instead, we've got a very abstracted experience. We're doing a job, not because we want to do it, but to get the money to do what we want to do. And we've got so much civilized stuff around us. All the buildings, all the equipment, our clothing, the way we dress, our glasses. It's hard to get the sense of wholeness. So we've ended up with a kind of fragmented experience where I can't take the whole into account. I've got to look after myself. And looking after myself and other people looking after themselves leads to a very different kind of interaction. So what I think I took from Africa was this sense of interconnectedness in which I belonged and in which I felt safe and in which I felt enriched by what was happening. When I left Africa, I went back to Europe and I found a very different experience. It was excellent in some ways and not in other ways.
I wonder if was a reliability about the way people and nature, the wildness interacted in Africa, because of course you drive down a road here, you can see the interconnectedness. Somebody puts their brakes on too hard and the impact through all of the traffic, but you don't know why anyone would put their brakes on too hard. But presumably in Africa, the way that particularly in the wild and presumably in Stone Age man, there was a reliability to how you would have known how people were likely to behave, how nature was likely to act and react.
Yeah, I guess it's reliability. It's more that it's commonly happening in all living things. So when you see a bird circling, why is that bird circling? Well, it's not circling for fun. It's not got a personal trainer teaching it to circle. You can see something on the ground. So what's on the ground? What's happening there? You see a bit of smoke. What's that? Is that the evidence of what's happening is all around. If you read it, you're quite safe. If you don't, like I remember one serious one, I was in Mozambique with my family on holiday on a beach, and somebody had made a big fire, and there was ash on the top, and just kind of larking around, walking along the sand, walk through the ash, and of course underneath the fire was still red hot. And I burnt my feet so badly the skin came off the sole of my feet. But what I knew was I wasn't awake. I wasn't attentive. The signs were all there. It was easy to read. So it's that kind of reliability, the interconnectedness. If you have that with a group of people, of course, you can get a sense of how to contribute or participate or when to propose caution or when to encourage people and so on. But if you're disconnected, you can't. The timing is not good. So timing's a big part of it. Yeah.
Let's then talk about the return to the UK. What was you've implied it, but just tell us a little bit more about the difference that you found here in the so-called civilized society.
Well, I have to give more context to be able to do that, but I had, whilst in Africa, found my partner, my wife, Jenny, and we had children. And what I had found still in Africa, we were living in Cape Town by then, and I was working as a systems analyst doing computer work. I suddenly realized this is very, very analytic. This is not healthy. And so what I did before our first child was born was decided to leave and went up into a farm, right up in the hills, and built a mud rondavel. And which is interesting, I spoke with one man over an hour and a half, say over lunch, then went and built it. But cut the tin was built from mud, thatched it, daughter was born there, my son a bit later. And from there, I farmed and just bartered rather than using money for a long period, and I had a very good sense of what the wild is like. The path we walked down to swim every morning, because there was no bathroom or bath, I took water down. You'd see a snake on the way there, whatever. So I had a very strong feel of what it's like to live naturally, not in a mechanized way. When I came back to Europe, it was very different. Driving down the road, there are endless signals and signs and conventions, how you walk through a doorway, how you park your car, how you do this and that. And the other. I mean, in where I was, you park your car under a tree for shade, otherwise it gets hot. You're in here, it's a yellow line, a double yellow line, pay, got to get back in time to get your car and whatever. So my initial experience was one of I wasn't very comfortable. I worked it out, but what I found hugely stimulating was the intellectual side of things. That led me to a much deeper experience, not only intellectual, but also the arts, the architecture, the history, the way in which civilization developed, the idea that you can develop a country so that you can change government without killing people, which is unusual. We might forget how unusual that is.
I'd like to ask a bit more about the time with Jenny, living in the Rondavel. You introduce the idea of Kairos and chronos and the experience of the natural rhythm and timing of things that you had in your life at that time, both raising kids and having a farm. Could you tell us more about Kairos and chronos?
Yeah, well, they're Greek words that relate to two different kinds of time. And the reason I brought that into the book was that explained exactly the difference between being in the wild and being in a civilized situation. In the Kairos is timing, and chronos is chronological time. So why civilization has been so successful is because we coordinate things through chronological time. We don't coordinate them through the season, the feel of it. We coordinate, if I want to meet you, I think the example I used in the book was in Paris at the Louvre on the 3rd of December at noon, I can do it. You'll be there, we'll meet. In the wild, you can't make that kind of arrangement. You're waiting for the right time. So my grandfather and uncles used to farm, and I used to go and help, and I liked it when we had harvest. It wasn't the 3rd of August or the 2nd of July, it was when the time's right. When will the wheat be ready for harvest? When it's fully grown. And it's got to be dry enough to harvest it. You've got to have your labour there, and you get the feel of it, and gradually it all comes together and you do it. You know? Now that translates still in relationship. When is the right time to say something to you that you don't want me to say and succeed in having you hear it? That's Kairos. So we go out for dinner, we find a bit of space or whatever it is. We try and get the spaciousness to be able to get the right timing. It's not at noon, here's my feedback. So that's why I brought in that distinction. The question is, could we, early man lived through Kairos, in my belief. You go hunting when you need food. You go hunting when animals are available. You choose the weaker animals. You don't affect the overall livestock and so on. But the question now, could we go back to that? Our civilization's too far gone. We can't live in Kairos apart from in small spurts. We have to take in chronos into account. So the big question was, how do we take into account chronos and Kairos? It's all chronos, it's mechanized and driven and impersonal. It's all Kairos, we end up on the margins, not able to be effective. How do you balance them is a big question.
Something else I'd like to take you back to, because having read the book, there was a period of time before you got married and were farming in Africa, and your time in Africa with your parents. And there was a period when you were traveling a lot. You went all over the world, had lots of different, very interesting experiences. But one which I'd like to pick up on, because I think it's important, stood out for me, was when you were on your own and a dog was knocked over.
Oh.
And you had to sleep in a ditch, and you looked up to the stars. Anyway, you tell the story. I just think it's important. Again, I think what I'm trying to do is pull out, there are some principles in these very early stories that are really important for dialogue work, and we'll cross-reference when we get to those later parts of the story.
There was clearly tension in me between my experience of living in the bush and what that meant to me, and my experience of being in, I was living near Reading in Newbury in the UK. There was a tension between them. And at one point as a young man, I went traveling. I went with friends down to Spain, and then when they drove back, I went off hitchhiking, and I hitchhiked down through Spain into Morocco and around Morocco. And I was searching for a way of reconciling that in a way. And I got kind of lost. And the incident you're describing or talking about, I was hitchhiking, but it was too late in the day to get a lift, really. You know, when it starts to get a little dark, it's twilight, people can't see you that clearly on the road. So I'm walking on the outskirts of a Spanish town down near Morocco, and it's not a very savoury place. And I'm on the road and I'm thinking, what am I going to do here? And feeling, not feeling that safe and not feeling that aware of how to manage it. And then a large dog came out, and what do you call a bucky in South Africa, an open back little truck came along, and it caught the head of the dog and it killed it immediately, but the body was flapping around on the side as it came past, and the kind of what would then be the carcass of the dog nearly hit me. At that point, I thought, this is the wrong time, the wrong place, not working for me at all. And I just dropped off down the road, and there happened to be a hedge there. I just climbed inside the hedge. It reminded me, you know, as a kid, you get into bed and pull the sheets over your head. Like, I just got to be safe and you forget the world. I'm in this hedge, absorbing what had happened. And then I could see through a little opening in the hedge, because I had a sleeping bag. I see through the hedge, and there was a very strong star. So I'm looking at this star, and the star kind of centered me. It kind of felt like that's the same star I looked at as we were outside our mud rondavel a dog, same star. And it feels very different, the state of the environment, but it's me on the planet. And something I felt like, it sounds silly, I felt like the star could see me and I could see it. There was a kind of recognition that I did belong here. I have to hide or fight to survive. I felt like I belong here. That experience, I think, dealt with almost all my fear. I don't recall after that being fearful in different civilized situations, including maximum security prisons and so on. Didn't feel it. So I think that led me then to a kind of search, because I did a lot of traveling, to understand the world of where I belong, and to understand how I belong, because it's a large world. I traveled continually around Europe. I traveled overland from London across to India, right across Europe and up into Nepal and so on. Traveled around South America. And, in a way, going for the extreme, I want to understand how I belong everywhere. I don't know if you know what I mean, but like I was walking at one point in Ireland, visiting a friend. There's some litter on the ground. And I said to him, in my town, you wouldn't have litter on the ground like that. And I thought, why is that their litter, not mine? So I pick up the litter and put it in a bin. Like, why would I think this is somebody else's, that I don't belong here? Belong everywhere. So I'm really trying to find my peace and place in the world, despite everything that's going on everywhere. I think that's what was driving me at that age. Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering what our listeners will be thinking, because you have had the opportunity, or found for yourself the opportunity, to go to those extreme places to test that. And I'm wondering what other people would be thinking about their own sense of belonging and testing that in different circumstances. I think it's...
What drives you to behave the way you do and to do the things you do.
Yeah, and I know in the book you talk about your confidence, and I've known you for a long time and I know you are a confident man, so I don't deny that. But it feels like it's more than I would normally think of as confidence in people. It's the kind of sense of belonging and rootedness from which the confidence arises. There may well have been other things in your life that, you said yourself, you had quite a privileged, comfortable background, and but it sounds like there's something a little bit more that was at the real heart of that.
It's taken me a while to realize what happened. So in my youth, driving overland across Europe and Asia into India was to find the other side of the world. It could have been South America. It's like, what's the other end of all of this? Now you can't do that. You can't do that. If you go now, I've seen the Taj Mahal in photos. You're getting messages from home. When I travelled, you couldn't contact anybody. If you could find a telephone, you could, but we went post-restaurant for a letter that had been written a month before. It's very hard now to experience the overall situation, but I realised the same thing led me to take LSD, for example, was to go, what's the other side of my mind, my experience? I learned a lot from it. So that was what would drive me then. It's much later, and that's the reflection on my own life from which I've learned firsthand, and which has fed itself into the dialogue work as well. So that's part of my idea, is as we work our way through this story, the dialogue should be obvious. And as you're bringing out, it should be obvious to other people why they're doing what they're doing and how to do what they're doing well. Yeah.
So in your travels, there was one experience you had that I could never experience, which is to be one of 5 men traveling in a Land Rover. Tell us that story. How did it happen, and what did you learn?
So I was at university age, I say at university age because I decided to take some time out of university, but with 4 colleagues similar age. We did brass rubbings in churches and sold them in Bayswater Road in London, raised enough money to buy a Land Rover. We set off from London. We had one night in London, the Rolling Stones had a concert, free concert in Hyde Park. And then the following morning off we drive across, left Monday, left Sunday, arrived Friday in Istanbul, and then on across, and had some fabulous experiences in the desert in Afghanistan, seeing caravans of camels in the middle of the night and so on. Like, powerful experience. One of the learnings I had was the 5 of us shared driving, and we'd be driving often at night because of the heat conditions and so on. One friend, just to give you a feel of it, he was reading a book. Each page, as he finished it, he'd tear it out and throw it away. What he was trying to do was really read the book, because the page was gone. We were experimenting in all sorts of ways. At times it didn't work well, inevitably, with 5 of you in one vehicle, long distances. And I was quite aware of that and quite happy to help people make it easier. But it dawned on me at one point, and this is self-reflection rather than from them, that I was quite a problem in the situation myself. That some of the ways I was behaving was causing some of the way they were behaving, which I didn't like. That sounds pretty simple learning. It's a difficult learning because it seems so obvious it's other people. Other people being difficult, awkward, rude, demanding, whatever. But I discovered from there it's a good idea to look at what I'm doing. Even though we're different, we're one system. And it takes a bit to realize that, the degree that that's the case. So that was a big learning for me, that it's a bit like when you see the car in front still got their indicator on, have a look at your indicator. Oh, I've got mine on as well. It's kind of like the signal is external, as it is in the wild, but the attention is internal as well as external. I think that's the big learning for me.
Yeah. Sounds like a continuation of seeing the birds circling in Africa and thinking, therefore it's circling because of this. And here it was in a social situation where you also were part of it, rather than looking at the system of the bird and the roadkill or whatever. Mm-hmm. You were actually one of the actors and influencing what's happening. Mm-hmm. And being able to see yourself in that as well as everybody else is quite a big journey.
And of course, you can influence the traffic, mm-hmm. rather than just be subject to it. If you drive at a careful distance in the right way, unconsciously other people start to do that. Equally, you can push and pull, and the traffic gets a bit more difficult, a bit more dangerous. So one's own behavior affects things a lot, you know. One of the things that interested me was when we left Cape Town, effectively dropped out of society, lived in Rondavel, had our daughter, managed to find a midwife who came to deliver our daughter. It was lovely. We had a border collie then, dog called Rama. He sat and watched the whole thing, and she was weighed in a scale with his little weights on and an apple to get the right weight and so on. What I learned is, as Jenny was breastfeeding Sarah, and we were working, growing vegetables, and I was milking cows every day and making cheese and so on. We'd be working, and then Jenny would say, oh, yeah, I think it's time to feed Sarah. And Sarah would be asleep in the Rondavel, which would be half a mile away. And he'd say, well, can you leave a baby half a mile away and be working? Absolutely, in the wild, it's not dangerous. She'd go back, and Sarah would just have woken up, not even be crying, but be ready to be fed. So watching that, I was thinking, how does Jenny know that Sarah needs feeding? Well, it was an experience in Jenny as well as in Sarah. They were very closely linked. And that connection between the two is a relationship that goes across space and time. It's a very important one, I think. So that led me later to start to think about things like containers, how you build an environment of relationship, which is not a physical, material one, but it's one of a more subtle nature. So my experience is watching my daughter growing up and how my wife managed that and my part in that and so on, are quite deeply bound up in the group work later and how to be effective with it. And not only that, what I noticed is if Jenny were not aware and sensitive, as in the wild, then of course Shira would be crying because she needed her food. And you start to realize that that container, that quality of relationship, is part of the safety and reliability you talked about. When do you have an accident? When that is not in place, when the quality of relationship is not good. So I do challenge in the book the idea of accidents. I think the idea of an accident is a false notion. They're not accidents, they happen for good reason. And if you're aware, you can track that and deal with it. So what's first-hand learning is doing just that. We had what we'd call an accident, a mishap. Let's think about it. What happened? Well, actually, all the information was there. The metaphoric birds and broken twigs were all there to tell us, but we weren't communicating it. We didn't have the open flow of conversation and meaning that would deal with it. And that's how you learn from first-hand experience rather than reading a book about how to do it. Book secondhand. So don't read my book and do it that way. The aim is to read the book to start to think, well, how do I learn from what's happening for me? Secondhand is different. Like I described meeting a man over an hour and then going and building a mud house. When I started farming, I knew nothing about it. I asked the agricultural officer to come and give me some guidance, because we had guava trees, we had acres of grapes, and later we planted lemons. How do I do this? He says to me, he says, what kind of, there are farms all around, what kind of car does your neighbour drive? I said, well, he drives a Mercedes. He said, do what he does. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, prune your grapes when he prunes his grapes. Mulch them when he mulches them. Just watch and copy what he does. You'll do okay. Goodbye. What I do, I copied it, and I did brilliantly. Now, that's second-hand learning. You can learn from other people, but it's only knowledge when you do it. After a while, I could see why we were pruning at that point. So there's nothing to be lost from reading a book and saying, okay, well, let me pick that up now. What would I do with that? It's fine. Third-hand learning's a bit harder. That's where you don't really know who's written it and what it's about. And you try it might be relevant, it might not. And a lot of people believe knowledge is just in the book. Do you want to know? Look it up. Real knowledge is not in the book.
So there's a difference either reading a book or talking to somebody and then doing something is one of the ways in which the knowledge that you take is converted into something firsthand. So the alternative is you read a book and then write an article about what you read, but it's never converted into your experience.
So it's both. One is who you're listening to. So I have a friend she's in Johannesburg, who is what I would call an awfulizer. So she tells me every day we don't have electricity most of the day, we don't have water several times a week. And what do I think? I think it's partially true, and because she's an awfulizer, I don't need to send money to get her out of Johannesburg. She'll do fine. Right? So I have to think, who's telling me this, and what kind of person are they, and why are they saying it that way? Now I have someone, say another friend who's very ambitious, and she tells me what he said, and I have to think, well, hold on, she's an awfulizer, he's very ambitious. How does this relate to me? You go a stage further, well, I read that in a magazine. Well, who wrote that? What were they intending? So it's a little bit of where's this information coming from? And then, as you say, if you don't do something with it, it doesn't become knowledge for you. And I have to remember there are three things now. What was the third one? You can look it up and so on. First-hand experience, the more you reflect on it, the more you realize. You ask me more about Stone Age people and my experience. I start to learn more from our conversation because it was first-hand. Second-hand, it doesn't have that surround to it. You know?
I wanted to add a couple of thoughts in terms of my learning, listening to you now, and they're not things I haven't thought before, but are coming up again for me. I was thinking when you were describing Jenny, your wife, and having a child. I remember when I had my first child, the midwife said to me, she said, it's a bit like I was breastfeeding. And she said, if you think about a dog, and I have two dogs, so I think she kind of knew that would be meaningful to me. She said, if you watch a mother dog, she'll be with her puppies and then she'll walk away. And then the puppies start, she knows when they're stirring and she goes back. Just think about yourself like that. Just deal with it like that.
Yeah.
And that's what I did. And it was both my kids, I think, the experience, the bond, that was just beautiful. I had a beautiful experience, I think, as a mother. And I think that when you talk about the connection to the wild, I do think that there are ways in which women can connect to that wild experience if they allow themselves to or are allowed to. And through the menstrual cycle, as well as through having children, it gives you have that opportunity to be in touch with natural rhythms in the world. But of course, we're kind of socialized to try and pretend that every day of the month is the same, or, stories of clients of mine who were told when they had their babies to, only take a maximum of a week off on maternity leave. And, have you not heard of a breast pump? Get yourself back to the office kind of thing. So, which is interfering with that natural experience.
Well, the big point that you're making, I think, and making it well, is that the natural cycles are moving through us all the time.
Yeah.
Even though we're distracted by the kind of activities that are going on. But being a mother is an innate process. It's innate to be found in oneself, the relationship with the child. The alternative is I read 5 books on how to look after a baby. I measure this, I weigh that. The question is, who are you and how do you find yourself in this world?
Yeah. And that does take some confidence or something to say, well, while I'm being bombarded with all these books and all this advice, actually I'll find out what's in me, which I think comes back to what I was saying about your confidence, which seemed to come from a grounding.
And is it terrible to have a menstrual cycle? It's part of the cycle. Like, so I'm a man, am I right to ask the question, how does one experience what's happening and understand the value of it? It's not there by chance. It's there for a purpose.
None of us would be here without it. So in each episode, we invite our readers and listeners from around the world to join us on the show. And during the next few sessions, we're going to be joined by Robert Sarley, who has 37 years' experience as an advisor to high net worth investors. Matthew Kapowski, who's founder of the Bohm Society. Leo Hilton, who's currently serving a long prison sentence. And Harold Clark, who is the senior statesman of US Corrections. He's run statewide departments of corrections for 39 years. But today we've got a question from Bernhard Holtrop in Sweden.
Peter, I read your book, and especially the first 3 chapters I paid attention to. In the description of your growing up, I'm touched by the polarities you became aware of in your early life. Civilization versus the wild, the more disinitiated love of your mother versus the physical closeness and love of your nanny, the UK versus Africa, your intuition, the free rock runner, your feeling into the Stone Age people versus your mental fascination, which wants to frame and model the world around you. Often in these events, there was a parting involved, an inevitable saying goodbye to the one to be with the other. and also later, living as an analyst versus an off-grid hippie. And it awoke some sadness in me, as if having to choose between the heads and the guts, leaving a torn heart in between to deal with. Do you recognize that? How did you experience this yourself?
I recognize that polarity in me as a young man, and I certainly was actively addressing it, not that consciously, at that time. Now I feel far more resolved about it. So, for example, I go to Africa every year and I'm in Europe every year, and so do the swallows. Every summer they come to Europe and every summer they go back to Africa. And that kind of resolution, it's not polarized for me now like it was. It was an either or, but there are two poles to the planet. It's one planet. And I feel it enriching the inclusion of both. So it's a key point to bring out as we move through the story. People do find themselves in polarized situations, saying we've got to do this or that. This is where the dialogue can hold opposite poles in the same place and be enriched by it. Yeah?
To what extent has this aspect of your journey, both the first imprint of this division into your youth, as well as your dealing with this polarity, contributed to your fascination and understanding of dialogue?
Well, the polarity has driven me to do many of the things I've done. And the reflection on what I've been doing and why I've been doing it has been very helpful to me. So I find when I go into a polarized situation, which might be management union situation or whatever, where people are at odds with each other, I can feel the polarization. I can feel how the different parties concerned are right, but I also can see how it's integrated in one thing, and I have some confidence that the whole system can be resolved. So it is a key thing to know and understand polarization and bring polarization into a holistic situation. That's, in a way, fundamental to the work. I think as we go through the book, we'll start to see how that plays out. So, well spotted, Bernard. That is definitely one of 4 or 5 key themes I've been working with, and I appreciate you formulating the question in that way.
Thanks for listening to A New Kind of Dialogue, the podcast, with me, Jane Ball, and Peter Garrett. If you're inspired by any of our thoughts today, visit dialogue-associates.com to find out more. Leave a review and give the show a 5-star rating if you enjoyed it, and subscribe so you can never miss an episode. Check out the show notes for extra information and links. Join us next time as we discuss chapters 4 through 8 of A New Kind of Dialogue, beginning with Peter's move into spirituality and his remarkable working relationship with theoretical physicist David Bohm.